So this is a story that some of you may have, I know at least some of you have already encountered, and some of you may know well. Um, and this is a classic story. On one reading, it's about the nature of Torah. And I brought it because we're approaching Shavuot. Um, and so it's a helpful text in that regard. But it has other meanings, and it's sort of the darling text of almost every movement, right? The Orthodox Judaism claims this story as part of its origin story and justification for its approach. The conservative movement claims it as its origin story and justification for our approach. Everybody loves this story. It is very often taught out of context, and with great frequency, the first half of the story and not the second half of the story is read. And when you read the whole story and you read it in context, it really changes the meaning very significantly. So the story and just so you know, I gave you here, the first page has the fundamental biblical text that is being addressed in this section of the Talmud, and Rashi's commentary there. And then I gave you several pages from the Art Scroll commentary. If you haven't encountered Art Scroll style before, just so you know what we're looking at, above the line is the Talmud text itself. Below the line are their footnotes. Within the Talmud text itself, you have the Aramaic text or the Hebrew, depending, followed by what is in bold is a translation of the words that are there, and what is not in bold is the Art Scroll editor's additions to make a complete sentence and make it comprehensible. The Talmudic text is much terser, and sometimes hard to just read. So when you see what's not in bold, that's their filling out of the narrative line and the text. So the story, I gave you all of this. We're not going to read all of this together, but I gave you all of this to give you the context. So if you look at the first page, the verse that we're looking at is from Exodus 22:20. V'ger lo toneh, you shall not oppress the stranger. Lo toneh. And the Rashi is concerned, and the Talmud is concerned with what does it mean to oppress? What are we talking about? Lo toneh is the verb. The noun form is ona'ah, oppression. So what is ona'ah? And as you'll see, Rashi says it means initially verbal harassment. Verbal harassment. We're not talking here about beating someone up but verbal harassment. Ona'ah is one of the characteristics of the experience in Egypt. Our experience in Egypt was characterized by three things: gerut, being a stranger in a strange land; avdut, being enslaved; and inui, being the victims of this ona'ah, of this oppression, whatever it is. And here we have two of those three. We have the stranger and we have ona'ah. Ona'ah specifically here is this verbal oppression. And the Talmud goes on for pages and pages and pages to spell out what verbal oppression is all about. What are we talking about here? So if you look at the page, I numbered it page 3, but it's actually the second page. It's the first page of the Art Scroll text, and you see at the in the middle of the page it says Mishnah. So that's the Mishnah that this Talmud is dealing with. And what it's dealing with begins to say, just as there is this ona'ah, this wronging in buying and selling, so there is ona'ah in words. Okay, and what does that mean? So look at what the Mishnah says here. You shouldn't say to someone, you shouldn't go into a store and say, how much is this item? Looking ahead on the next page, if you have no intention of buying it. That's the first example, because you're misleading the storekeeper, right? You don't go and you don't ask someone who's trying to sell someone, how much is it? You're going to raise their expectations. You're not going to buy it. Then, if someone was a Baal Tshuva, someone was a penitent, you don't say to them, remember your former deeds. Right? Someone is now observing kashrut. You don't say to them, yeah, look at you. You used to go around eating bacon all the time, right? If somebody has, committed a crime and served time and repented, you don't bring up their past. Or if somebody is a descendant from converts, you're not allowed to remind them, remember the deeds of your ancestors. And then they quote our verse, "V'ger lo toneh," as you shall not oppress a ger. Here they're reading it not just as a stranger, but a convert. The Talmud then goes on at length to spell out all these possible ways that someone could oppress someone with words, right? You think about our contemporary society. We're talking about bullying, we're talking about name calling, we're talking about misleading people, right? It's all different ways in which one can abuse people verbally. And it becomes associated with hurt feelings. And the Talmud goes on for pages and pages and pages. I gave it to you so that you'll have it. You can read it on your own. Shaming someone in public, nicknames. Based on this section in the Talmud, it's here that nickname is, giving someone a derogatory nickname is a form of verbal oppression. Maimonides, by the way, picking up on this text in the Talmud, says that one who gives somebody negative issue forfeits forfeits their place in the world to come. That's how serious it is. Right? Because it's so reductive. You reduce somebody's humanity to some kind of epithet. And that's, the Talmud is dealing with this over and over and over again. And then we get the story. So with that background, let's look at the story. And the story is found on, I marked it as page 8 on the bottom. And this is the story that is known as the oven of Aknai. And why is it called the oven of Aknai? Because they're dealing with this particular oven. And as the Talmud says, they wound arguments around it like snakes. I'll give you the background of the oven. Like basically what we're dealing with here is disruptive technology, right? That's what it is. We have principles of ritual purity and impurity. And the concern is if somebody dies in the house, which was very common then, people died at home, right? Anything that is susceptible of ritual impurity that is under the roof has to be broken and created anew. So if you have a vessel holding water and somebody dies in the house, the vessel becomes impure. You have to shatter the vessel and make a new one. So the question is, what about an oven? An oven is not an inexpensive thing to make. Somebody comes up with a new technology to build an oven in which the pieces are layered with sand. And if it's layered with sand, maybe it's not actually a complete vessel. And if it's not a complete vessel, then maybe it doesn't become impure. Now, this is a good thing in a lot of ways. It's a good thing for the inventor, right? He wants to make a living on this new technology. And it's a good thing for people who can get it, because then somebody dies in the house, mortality rates are very high. You don't have to keep breaking the oven and getting a new one. It's a good thing. And what happens if you look at the at the very bottom of 59A, or the top half, the bottom, the last paragraph, you see it says the following Mishnah alludes to an incident. The text itself says, we have learned there in a Mishnah, if someone cuts sections for an oven and puts sand between the sections, which then keeps them together this way, Rabbi Eliezer declares it tahor. Rabbi Eliezer says it's pure. We don't have to worry about it. But the sages said it's tameh. No, this doesn't solve the problem. It can still become ritually impure. Somebody dies in the house, you got to smash the oven. That's the case. And turning to the next page, they then say, and this is called the oven of Aknai, the coiled serpent. Why? What is meant by the coiled serpent? Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, it means that they, the sages, surrounded it, this oven, with arguments like a coiled snake. That's the setup. So the story begins. I think it's probably easier, given the format here, for me to read and just expound as I go, and then we can discuss the meaning. So the part of the story that everyone usually reads is this. Everybody with me? We're at the top of page 9.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So a Baraita taught. A Baraita is just a text that from the Mishnaic period, 200 CE, that wasn't included in the Mishnah. Same time period, but it's not technically, it's not in there. On that day, Rabbi Eliezer advanced all the arguments in the world. But the sages didn't accept his arguments. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha accords with me, if I'm right, let the carob tree prove it. Whereupon the carob tree was uprooted from its place, and it moved 100 amot. An amot is a measure. So the carob tree gets up and walks. The sages said, you don't make halacha from a carob tree. You don't bring proof from a carob tree. He then said to them, if the halacha accords with me, let the water of this canal prove it. Whereupon the water flowed backwards. The canal starts to flow uphill. The sages said to him, you can't bring proof from a water canal. He said to them, if the halacha accords with me, let the walls of the study hall, the Beit Midrash, prove it. Whereupon the walls of the Beit Midrash leaned and were about to fall, at which point Rabbi Yehoshua stood up and rebuked the walls. And Rabbi Yehoshua said to them, if Torah scholars are arguing with each other about matters of Torah, of halacha, what business is it of yours? The walls didn't fall out of respect for Rabbi Yehoshua, but neither did they right themselves out of respect for Rabbi Eliezer. And they still continue to lean to this day. Right, a little verisimilitude there. Like this, you hear the fairy tale story aspect of this kind of storytelling. Rabbi Eliezer then said to the sages, if the halacha accords with me, let heaven prove it. God is going to back me up. Whereupon a bat kol in modern Hebrew is an echo. In Rabbinic Hebrew, it's like a hint of a divine voice, went forth and proclaimed, why do you dispute with my son, Rabbi Eliezer? With Rabbi Eliezer, whom the halacha always follows. The halacha is like him in all cases. Whereupon Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his his feet and declared, Lo b'shamayim hi. A quote from the Torah, from Deuteronomy, it is not in heaven. This is from Moses' last speech to the people at the end of Deuteronomy before he dies, when he says, it is not in heaven that you should say, who's going to go up to heaven to get it for us, nor is it across the sea that you should say, who will cross it to get the Torah from us, for us. No, it is in your mouth and in your heart that you may do it. It's right here. So Rabbi Yehoshua rebukes God with God's own Torah and says, you told us the Torah is not in heaven. You gave it to us, it's ours. Okay? What is meant by Lo b'shamayim? It's not in heaven. Rabbi Jeremiah explains the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. You gave it to us. You, God, stay out of it. The rest of Rabbi Yehoshua's response, we don't pay attention to a heavenly echo because you already wrote in the Torah at Sinai, and this is a verse from Exodus, Acharei Rabim lehatot. You should follow according to the majority. Right? So Rabbi Yehoshua is arguing to God, you gave us the Torah. It's not some mystical thing. We're not waiting for prophetic voices. You told us, follow the majority. And now it's up to us. I'll finish the part of this is the part of the story that everybody always reads. I'll finish it. Rabbi Nassan happened one day to meet Elijah, and he said to him, what was the Holy Blessed One doing at that moment? And Elijah responded to him saying, God was laughing and saying, Nitzchuni banai, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. So that's the story that is, almost everybody stops there, right? Now, if we stop there, and I want to problematize this for a little bit, as we look at it, but if we stop there, what's the meaning of the story basically, and what's it about? Mark,
Not
yeah.
to let okay.
Provides latitude for humans to interpret halakha.
Right. Howard, did you want to add to that?
No, and God doesn't want to be involved in those disputes.
Right. Not only doesn't want to be involved, but is delighted, right? God appears here like a proud parent, right? I taught you how to do this. It's yours. You make it your own, right? You can see why this is the darling of every movement, because the Orthodox tradition says this is about continuing revelation. This is the authority for Rabbinic Judaism. We can take the Torah, and by majority rule of scholars, we can create this whole edifice of halakha. And it's up to us to determine. You can see why the conservative movement loves it, right? We take this and we say, halakha evolves over time. We have a right and majority rule to evolve the law. Now, a couple of things I want to highlight here. First of all, a little anxiety here expressed in the text. Why do they need this coda about Elijah? Right? With great confidence, they're saying, it's our Torah. God, you gave it to us. We don't have to depend on divine voices anymore. But by the way, we're just telling you at the end, there was a divine voice that said that God agreed with us. Right? Like that's right? God actually supports our methodology that writes God out of the text. Or not out of the text, but out of the process. Okay? So that's one thing. The second thing you need to know is that when Rabbi Yehoshua quotes this verse from Exodus to say, follow after the majority, if Rabbi Yehoshua were doing that in an American court of law, he would be sanctioned under Rule 11 for misleading the court. Because the verse actually says exactly the opposite. You shall not follow the majority to do harm. It's like the classic first-year lawyer mistake of quoting a case out of context and taking out the not, right? So the language is there. He just omitted, you shall not follow after the majority to take a mistake, make a mistake. This is an extraordinarily radical text. Really radical. I mean, it's so postmodern in its reading. Like the author's intent is not dispositive. It's what each generation does with it and interprets it in that time. It's not in heaven anymore. It's chutzpahdik. Now, part of what's going on here, so why is Rabbi Eliezer so out of bounds? Because this is a scary thing to do. And so the sages are basically saying, you may be a genius, Rabbi Eliezer. You may be right from a divine point of view, but we need boundaries and rules in how we're going to go about this. We can't have a charismatic genius challenging the majority. In that sense, it's a very democratic text, right? We don't want a community based on charisma and exceptional genius. We want a halakha that creates norms from a majority with respectful discourse in which we make a decision and we stick with it. You know, I mean, anybody who sat on a board knows the problem of the individual who always thinks they're right and the board votes, and this individual keeps, but they're wrong because of this and they're wrong because of that, and keeps pushing and pushing and pushing, and the board can't move forward, and people and the decisions get undermined for whatever the organization is. You can't have that, even if the person is brilliant. There's multiple anxieties here. There's an anxiety about the legitimacy of the move to say the period of prophecy is over. We're taking this to ourselves. We have a right to interpret Torah. We're going to do it by the majority. But there's the anxiety about whose voice counts and what happens when there's a charismatic who we ourselves, in telling the story, acknowledges objectively right. Objectively right. I mean, when they wrote this story, they didn't have to include the part where the divine voice comes and says, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer? He's right. They're specifically setting up a case to say, like a claim to objective accuracy in God's eyes is not what matters. What matters is the process and respect for the majority. That's where if you leave the story here, that's what it's about. Right? Thoughts on the story as we're here now? Anybody want to weigh in? I mean, you could study this text for hours and hours, but any other thoughts that emerge right here?
Yeah. Am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
Okay. What is known about the relationship between Eliezer and the rest of the court prior to this conflict? Right.
Okay. So it's hard to know what's known prior because it's hard to know which events occurred before or after things. We will see as we move into the rest of the story, some of the personalities fleshed out in a different way. He is a charismatic genius. I don't know of any conflicts like this. Like, I don't know if there were any pre-existing resentments against him. There might have been. I mean, you imagine a personality who both would do this and can do this. Right? Like, who can make the carob tree get up and move and the water flow in the wrong direction and bring down the very walls of the Beit Midrash? He has extraordinary power. So presumably we can imagine this isn't the first time he's evoked his genius and his charisma. and maybe there is some resentment and worry about it. And I think that image of the walls, the walls, him about to crash in, is a genuine threat to the system. Right? Metaphorically, that's pretty, yeah. Mark?
Question. From a conservative movement perspective, and I suppose Reform Reconstructionist, there's a lot here to help support and justify the movement and its roots and perspective. But interested for your point of view, how an Orthodox or an ultra-Orthodox Haredi might read this.
Yeah. So the reason why it's the darling of the Orthodox movement as well, or Orthodox Jews, is that Orthodox Judaism is not biblical Judaism, it's Rabbinic Judaism. That's true of Haredi Judaism too. They do not read the Torah text literally, and they feel absolutely free, as the Talmud did, to read verses out of context. And this is the text that puts all the authority in the rabbis. This is the text that says it's the Talmud that is legitimate for normative practice because God has agreed. It's not in heaven. So the rabbinic enterprise, which said, we're going to create this entire edifice of Jewish practice. Some of it is grounded very explicitly in the Torah, and you can see that. And some of it, as the Talmud itself says, is mountains hanging by a hair. You'd be very hard pressed to find explicitly where does the Torah say that you have to wait 3 hours after eating meat before you can eat dairy? The Torah says you don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Technically, it prohibits cooking directly meat and milk together. Nobody ever said you need 2 sets of dishes. That's rabbinic. Right? Like volumes and volumes of Talmud are created by the rabbis, and this justifies it. You left it to us. We interpret it. And don't tell us we're misreading the Torah, because guess what? God said, that's what I want you to do. Right? It's so chutzpahdik and radical. Yeah, Marcelo.
To me, it's interesting that, oftentimes the Talmud, when it departs from the strict reading, it's to make things more lenient for society, more merciful, right? And and here it's Rabbi Eliezer's interpretation that's the one that's kind of the more lenient one,
right,
for society.
Right. So I don't think it's true that they often make it more lenient. Sometimes they do, sometimes the other way. But it's very important here that Rabbi Eliezer is looking for a leniency here. He's looking to make society more liberal, so the stakes are actually high, right? And as we get into the head of Rabbi Eliezer and the sages, why is he insisting on this? One possibility is he's an egomaniac who's insisting I'm right. And when I'm right, I'm going to fight to the death. On the other hand, he could arguably be the one who's a populist here and saying, right, this matters to people. This is an economic issue for a lot of people. You're holding to a stringency that is very costly. And if we can find a way to make this permitted to people, we ought to do it. Why are you holding to this? Right. And this, by the way, this is, where we look at the conservative movement and the Orthodox movement, right? And Orthodox Jewry, there are lots of times where the conservative movement is looking and saying, there are reasons why we want to move toward leniency. It matters. There are stakes, right? It's not just that we want to be easy or lazy. Like, people's dignity is at stake. People's livelihoods are at stake. And it's not just status issues like the inclusion of women. This is a purity-impurity issue. Think about the laws of Passover. Passover is expensive. Not everybody can afford to get rid of all the food and buy new. Not everybody can afford the jacked up prices that places charge for kosher Passover food. Right? If we can have leniencies, it matters. Yeah, Alicia.
So it appears that what matters above everything else not what's needed by the community, not what Torah says, not what makes sense. What matters is the authority of the rabbis. That's it. That's the.
Well, I would tweak that a little bit. I would tweak that a little bit, and I think that, and I would say it not as a self-aggrandizing the authority of rabbis, right? They're looking to establish a system and process that will hold. You know, like if you think about it in contemporary political terms, one of the things they're struggling with is we're trying to establish a constitution with democratic norms. What do we do with a charismatic who threatens those norms? And at what point do we say the particular case, even if it's helpful to the people in this particular case, can't be allowed to undermine the norms that will enable us to go forward on a sustainable, legitimate footing? We're saying a majority vote has to count. You're saying you know you're right. And you may be right. And in this instance, it may be that that would be a helpful ruling for people. But we can't allow you to just undermine all the norms that we've established, because then we have nothing. That's the issue. Now, I'm going to move forward because I want you to see the so what does this have to do with the Mishnah that we started with? What's the halachic context? Ona'ah, oppression. Who's oppressing who here? What is the story doing in that context? Now look at the rest of the story. So if you look at the bottom on page 9 there, where it says they said that on that day, so they make the ruling. God, through this heavenly voice, says, when we don't listen to heavenly voices, but we're listening to the heavenly voice that says, here, you were right. And what happens? They said that on that day, the sages collected all the matters, all the things that Rabbi Eliezer had declared pure, and going over to page 10, and burned them in fire. The commentary says in his presence. And they voted on him and they excommunicated him. This is the part of the story people don't often say, right? Not only did they say, we're overruling you on this issue of this oven, but we are overturning every single decision you ever made, and we are banning you from the Beit Midrash. You're excommunicated. This is cancel culture. You've crossed the line, you are out. Literally, it's canceled. Like, that is exactly what it is. No one can talk to you. No one can learn from you. Your Torah is invalid. We are done. Okay? Then they said, who will go and tell him? Rabbi Akiva said, I will go. Lest an unfit person go and inform him and bring about the destruction of the entire world. What did Rabbi Akiva do? He dressed in black and cloaked himself in black and sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 amot. Social distancing, right? He dresses in mourning, and he goes and he stays at a distance. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, why is today different from other days? Rabbi Akiva replied to him, Rabbi, my teacher, it seems to me that your colleagues are removed from you. Rabbi Eliezer too tore his garments and removed his shoes and slid off his chair and sat on the ground, and tears flowed from his eyes. So Rabbi Akiva says, right, I better go because I know that I love him, and I can say this respectfully, and I can tell him gently. And he goes and he signals and he hints. It seems to me they have distanced from you. He doesn't say you're excommunicated. Rabbi Eliezer gets the message and he dons, and he too goes into mourning. He does kriya. He tears his clothes. That's what we do when we lose a loved one. And he sits on the ground and he cries. At that time, the world was smitten. A third of the world's olives, a third of its wheat, a third of its barley was ruined. And some say even dough that was that a woman was already kneading became spoiled. Now, why is Rabbi Akiva worried about who's going to tell Rabbi Eliezer lest it destroy the world? Because oppression and hurt feelings are a huge no-no in God's eyes. And Rabbi Akiva is worried, okay, you want to protect the system, I get it. You don't have to be nasty to him, right? You don't have to excommunicate him. You don't have to, in front of him, say, we're overturning every decision you ever made. What's that about? Is this about protecting the system, or is this about something else? And if he gets hurt, a sage with the merit of Rabbi Eliezer, with so much Torah, who's such a charismatic figure, if he's hurt, God is not going to be pleased. That's where this story turns. And then it gets better. Look what follows. A great blow, a great destruction occurred that day. For every place on which Rabbi Eliezer set his eyes went up in flames. Everywhere he looks, he's like causing destruction. And even Rabbi Gamliel is the head of the Sanhedrin. Rabbi Gamliel is in charge of this whole process. And Rabbi Gamliel, we know, has a tendency towards arrogance and elitism, and is not hesitant, we know this from other stories, to use a little bit of force, not physical force, but pressure to exert his will, and sometimes at the cost of humiliating colleagues. Rabbi Gamliel is a complicated figure. So Rabbi Gamliel, who was the Nasi at the time, was in a boat, and a gale threatened to drown him. And he said, it seems to me that this is only because of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanos. So he stood on his feet and said, Ribono shel olam, it is well known to you, master of the universe, that I did not do this for my own honor or for the honor of my father's house, but for your honor, so that disputes not proliferate in Israel. Whereupon the sea subsided from its raging. Right now, so look at first of all, the sense of mysticism here. Like the sages have this ability to speak to natural forces in God, but there really is a sense here that Rabbi Gamliel's life is threatened for doing this, because of doing this to Rabbi Eliezer, and he has to justify himself and saying it wasn't an ego battle. It wasn't about me, and it wasn't about the honor of my foot. It wasn't about my authority. It's about the system.
It just sounds like standard political rationalization.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
And he was just trying to save himself when he said that.
Right. It absolutely does. On the other hand, God responds, the sea subsides. Right. And what I want to say is the text is this story in all of its richness, and it's not over yet. There's another piece of this, right, is really struggling with all of the complexities of the reality of creating a human system. Because we can't have just a divine system. Wouldn't survive. Right? If we had a system in which we believe that the Torah in its written form is the express, direct, last word of God, nothing can be changed, there is no room for human interpretation, it would be a disaster. Right? We can't live by the Torah alone. Mark.
I mean, it's also like what you said before. It's if it's a minority opinion, it's a minority opinion. Like majority can't be ruled by a minority opinion. It's like the one holdout at the board. Like there's validity to minority opinions and different points of view, but at some point, like you got to move on.
That's right. That's right. And they're recorded in the Talmud, right? The Talmud's very careful to record the minority opinion. Why? A later court may agree with that minority opinion. At some point, the dissent may become the majority opinion. But you can't just keep fighting about it, right? So we can't have a divine system. We have to have the human hand in it. But how do you structure that in a way that's going to be functional? And what do you do with the fact that human beings are always complex? Right? Is it ever possible to say my motives are 100% pure? Of course, human ego and power struggles and are going to come into play. Like, public servants who start out with a real desire to serve the public. Eventually you get your own, you're in power, you want to keep your job, your ego is at stake. We're all human, right? So nothing about this system can ever be pure. Because human beings, even if we're going with the majority, could be wrong. We don't have absolute knowledge. It could be the case that the majority, with all good intentions, who are really smart, come up with something that from God's perspective is wrong. But we can't have a system that functions like that. Right? And it's also true that there are sometimes ego on both sides. Is Rabbi Eliezer purely concerned, Marcelo, about about a permission for people who need it? He's clearly concerned about that. Is it only that? Or is there also a little showmanship here? There might be. Is Rabbi Gamliel only concerned for the structure and the survival of the institutions? He's clearly concerned about that. Is there something also about his own power? Probably also. Think about the complexity of what's going on for a John Roberts. What is he balancing? He's got the concern for the integrity of the court. He's got his vision of what's good for the country. He's also aware of the challenges going on, and he's a human being. Right? I'm sure that there are times when he's ticked off at challenges to his authority. How do you manage that? We're all human. The best of us and the less than best of us all struggle with this. Okay, so we've got this situation now where we've moved from the Beit Midrash out into the world, and we're seeing the destructive implications of what was a debate about the law that became personal. Everybody crossed the boundaries. Rabbi Eliezer crossed boundaries in invoking all of these mystical things. And it seems like Rabbi Gamliel and the sages crossed boundaries by saying, not only did we defeat you, we're excommunicating you, you're out, there's no room for you anymore, and we're invalidating all your decisions. Alicia.
And then, okay. So they not only say, here's what the law is, what we say it is. It's not in heaven, it's what we say. But they also want to punish and humiliate and exclude Eliezer. They could have just rested with saying, here's the decision, like it or lump it, that's it. Instead of which they become destructive,
right?
Not only to him but to the people,
right? In
response to which he then becomes destructive. His anger blazes and burns whatever he looks at. So it's looking as if everything is real.
Right.
Everything is in crisis.
That's exactly right.
But another thing that's going on, it seems to me, I don't know if you think so, is there are a number of places in Torah I don't know from Talmud, but there are a number of places in Torah where you as the audience, you as the reader, are forced to feel sorry for somebody who's doing wrong.
Right.
Forced to. You're
Right.
forced to feel there's this side and there's this side, and this side may be wrong, but you must feel pity. And it doesn't tell you to, it just makes you.
Right.
And I think this is a similar occasion.
Yes. Yes. So that's where the ona'ah comes in, and your sympathies shift over time, right? Like at first, you may we may say the sages have a point here, and then when they go overboard, we feel bad for Rabbi Eliezer, right? Yes, absolutely, and it's going to shift again. Like we're going to really, because I do want to make sure that we get to the end of the story because it changes the meaning again. But that's so that's the crossing of the boundary, that it turns into a personal thing. And I want to lift up in particular what you pointed out, Rabbi Eliezer. It's not just anger; it's shame. The rabbis are very, very sensitive to the destructive power of shame. And what happens when someone is humiliated, ona'ah, this oppression. Right, you think about the cases. You don't say to someone who has done tshuva, who has changed, look what you used to do. You don't say to someone who's a descendant of converts, look what your ancestors used to do. You don't embarrass people publicly, and it's because shame becomes anger. Shame is one of the most destructive forces in the world, and that's what we're seeing here: hurt and shame. They didn't have to humiliate him and exclude him. So let's get to the rest of the story because it changes all again. So on page 10, the second column halfway through, look who emerges. Ima Shalom, Rabbi Eliezer's wife. All of a sudden we have a woman, and we have a woman with a name, which is very rare in the Talmud. And her name means mother of peace. Ima Shalom. It's a beautiful name, or peace mother, right? Ima Shalom, who is the wife of Rabbi Eliezer and the sister of Rabban Gamliel, who's the head of the Sanhedrin. Now we know Rabbi Eliezer and Rabban Gamliel are brothers-in-law. Look at that. So Ima Shalom was the sister of Rabban Gamliel. From that day onward, from that incident onward, she did not let her husband, Rabbi Eliezer, fall on his face. What does that mean? After you pray the Amidah, we pray what's called Tachanun. And on a weekday, if you've ever been to, a weekday minyan, it's when we go like this, right? We pray like this. It's an echo of literally prostrating on the ground on your face in penitential prayers. At that time in the Talmud, it was the point in prayer where you would pour out your heart before God in personal pleas and prayers, right? And she wouldn't let him do it. She'd stand there when he's praying in the morning and not let him. Nope, you're not praying that. Nope, you're not praying that.
Why?
One day, why not? It'll come about and it'll explain itself in a minute. One day, she thought it was Rosh Chodesh, the new month. You don't pray Tachanun on the new month. You're not allowed to pray those petitionary prayers. But she confused the calendar. She thought it was a 30-day month and it was only a 29-day month, so it actually wasn't Rosh Chodesh. Or there are those who say that a poor person came and stood at the door and she went to give him bread. Very evocative image. One way or another, she didn't stop him. Rabbi Eliezer fell on his face and prayed this prayer. And when she found him doing that, she said to him, "Get up, you have killed my brother." What is this about? God listens to the cry of the oppressed. She knows how hurt he is. She knows how angry he is. She knows how humiliated he feels. And she knows that if her husband pours out those pleas before God, God is going to act and punish Rabban Gamliel. God will listen to him. And so she stands, so she says, you've killed my brother, right? She wasn't there to stop him. Look at the next page. Meanwhile, an announcement went forth from the house of Rabban Gamliel stated that he had died. Rabbi Eliezer said to her, his wife, how did you know? She said to him, I have received from the house of my father. She's presumably descended from King David. All the gates of heaven are locked except for the gate of Ona'ah. Now, what does this mean? This is the most radical ending to the story. This connects the whole story back to what is it doing here? The gates of Ona'ah. There is a tradition in the Talmud that since the destruction of the temple, God has nothing but the 4 cubits of halakha. God lives in the halakha. This story quotes a different tradition in the name of an Ima Shalom, a woman quotes it, right? Since the destruction of the temple, where we used to go and the gates of the temple were open, all the gates of prayer are closed, except the gate of wounded feelings. In some versions of that teaching, it's except the gate of tears, right? God may listen to prayers. God may not listen to prayers. We have a more attenuated relationship to God after the destruction of the temple. We can't just go into the Holy of Holies and encounter God. But one gate is always open, a direct pathway to God, the gate of shame and pain and hurt feelings. That's the end of the story. Ima Shalom has the last word. Now, when you think about this like literarily, we have this very chutzpahdik text in which the rabbis say, we have the authority to interpret Torah. We're claiming this for ourselves. The majority rules. And it's in the context of a whole section about the hurt feelings of the ger, the other. In claiming this for themselves, they make one of their own into an other. They excommunicate him. That cancel culture, you're out. And the last word belongs to the paradigmatic other, the woman who has no place in the Torah discussion at all, but who knows a tradition that this brilliant Rabbi Eliezer doesn't even know. How did you know? I have it from my father, she says. The last word in the story is Torah in the mouth of a woman. What could be more humiliating to the sages in their worldview? Right, and so the story that everybody claims we have the right to interpret Torah, when you take it out of its context, which the rabbis feel totally free to do to the Torah, by the way, we're now doing to them, to this text. And in many ways, what the story is really about is, okay, you rabbis, you want to take authority to interpret Torah, good. But you make sure you remember that there's a derech eretz kadma Torah. Derech eretz, basic human decency precedes Torah. You're so worried about the culture of the Beit Midrash, you're so worried about the procedures. If you're not nice people, you oppress people, your Torah is going to be destructive. And don't think God's going to back you up. Because the moment that person who's hurt by you cries out to me, God says, you're in trouble. Right? It's such a different story than it's usually taught because it's much more complicated. Much more complicated. This is much harder to live. You know, that lo bashamayim here and God saying, my children have bested me. It's a great punchline. And it's really important. It matters. But it's Ima Shalom who gets the last word. right? And who gets excluded by the culture. So, we're sitting in that tension of there have to be boundaries of discourse. There have to be. We can't have a society, on one level, they're right. We can't let Rabbi Eliezer just be this charismatic. We can't. On the other hand, we have to be really careful about who and how gets excluded in the people get excluded in the process, because exclusion and humiliation and hurt is so destructive, right? And that's the tension. How to create societies that have good functioning boundaries that don't humiliate? And by the way, I think this is like, this is the board service problem again. Like, what do you do with the person who isn't going to play by the rules, who's going to insist every time I'm right, no matter what the majority says? You have to set boundaries, but how do you do it in a way that doesn't humiliate?
Well, it goes way beyond the board service issue, because I see it's really about respecting the minority, even if you don't agree, and your view ended up being dominant, but you're right. I mean, that's what we become now with cancel culture, and there's no regard for the minority. There's only, we're living in a black and white world.
Right. That's right.
If you're not right, you're wrong.
That's right.
And it's very sad, but
right. Yeah. And the central figures are, Rabbi Akiva, who as a leader seems to be the only one who really understands this, right? That there has to be sensitivity. You can't just, let that polarization and that on-off switch, the black-white mentality rule, and Ima Shalom, who is trying to sustain and let her husband heal without, in the end, there becomes cancel culture here, right? Like, it's a tragedy on all sides because of the insensitivity, because of the inability to hold the tensions of needing to have boundaries, and there needing to be a consensus view, and there needing to be a productive, constructive process, and needing that process also to be able to hold the outliers. This is where, and we do see this in our society now very often. Sometimes the person who gets canceled is because they've said something hurtful and now you're out. And sometimes it's the person who's really a little bit ahead of their time. And the community can't yet hear what the person is saying. We're doing this on all sides. And it's why I think it's so important to reclaim the full context of this text. This text is not about the authority of the rabbis. This is about the importance of human dignity. And that the authority of the rabbis has to be upheld within that ability to hold human dignity. And in many ways, it's about emotional maturity and regulation. It's about becoming people like Rabbi Akiva. So, yes, we could go on forever, and I realize that we're at our time. Happy Chag Sameach, everybody. May you receive dignifying, loving Torah. May this Shavuot really help us to hold everybody's dignity.
Thank you so much, Rabbi
Thank you very
Uhrbach.
much.
Just reminding everybody, our next class is June 3rd, which will be our last class of this school year. And then we'll resume next year after the high holiday. So happy Chag Sameach.
Yes.
Enjoy your Shavuot, and we will hopefully see everybody on June 3rd.
Yeah. We'll see you on the other side of Sinai.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
Thank you.